All right, so where did we leave off last week?
The political pyramid.
Right, we were doing Weber's pyramid, right? And I haven't quite finished explaining that as much as I would like to. So let's finish up with that. So this is the pyramid of political authority. And by the way, for those of you watching the video, I started it late because we gave the pop quiz and went over the answers. So what was at the base of the pyramid? Force or threat, right? The basis of every state. And one spot up was patronage, or its opposite being sanction. And the top in general is the best source of authority for a government. Legitimacy. Right. And it has three components according to Weber. And what are they? Tradition. Charisma.
Legal system.
Yeah, we'll call it a rational legal system. That's the one David likes.
The best one.
Well, I should think so. And that in fact takes me right to what I wanted to say. There's a problem with traditional sources of legitimacy. That's where your legitimacy comes from. Well, this is the way we've always done things, right? I'm tempted to play the Monty Python skit for you, but I'll play a different one when we get to colonialism. What's the problem with the traditional source of legitimacy? This is how it's always been. They've always been the nobles, the aristocracy, the king.
I think it's like society changes and it needs to be more modern.
Say again?
Society changes, so it needs to be more modern.
Okay, tradition doesn't deal well with change. And especially once we get to the Industrial Revolution happening in Europe and then spreading out, and the competition between the Muslim world and Europe, traditional sources of legitimacy can be very problematic in these eras of exponentially increasing levels of change. In fact, if you're bringing in new ways of doing things, if you're the Ottoman Sultan and you're pursuing the Tanzimat reforms, well, almost by default, you're undermining your traditional source of legitimacy. Because tradition, for tradition, change is anathema, right? So it can be very problematic. So even today, when we look at Saudi Arabia as basic an issue of, should women be allowed to drive? It was only last year women got the right to drive in Saudi Arabia. And so some people are like, well, why are these rulers in the Stone Ages? You see the Saudi royal family in like Beirut or Monaco or Paris, and these are modern, well-educated, they studied at Oxford and so forth. Like, what's going on here? And if you speak with them, they'll say, well, we have a very conservative traditional population, and if we mess with things too quickly, then they're not happy. What they're really saying is, if change happens too quickly, it undermines the basis of their traditional sources of legitimacy, and hence their authority, their political authority. But at some point, tradition just isn't enough in a fast-changing world. Charisma can be a great source of legitimacy. Can someone give me examples of some charismatic leaders from history? And they could be good guys or bad guys, as long as they've got charisma. Hitler, definitely a charismatic leader. Most people in the German nation seem to adore him at the time. He instilled all kinds of adoring reactions, and his enemies loathed him. That's always the flip side of charisma. The charismatic leader is seen as, by some elements of the population, as the quintessential representative of them and who they want to be, but others see him as the worst possible, especially if they're from outsiders. So, if we name any charismatic leader, you can look at their traditional opponents from outside the nation and if they hate the guy, right? So what's another one besides Hitler?
Kennedy.
Kennedy, charismatic leader. And hated in much of the Republican establishment at the time in a big way, but a charismatic leader. He wasn't around long enough to do that much to really compare him to like Hitler or good ones, you know, like, I mean, there's Gandhi was one. So I don't want you to think it's just Hitler or Stalin. Stalin wasn't maybe that charismatic. Not a good example. Mao Zedong, no, right? Mao Zedong killed more people, by the way, than Stalin or Hitler. But a charismatic leader. Gandhi, charismatic leader. Martin Luther King,
Absolutely.
charismatic leader. Now, in the 1960s in this country, outside the black American community and their allies, Martin Luther King was loathed, right? He was assassinated, right? That's the flip side of charisma. But it's a great source of legitimacy because people so admire the leader that they willingly respond to calls for action or mobilization and accept the authority of the government that the leader heads, right? And that's gold for a government. You don't need a policeman on every corner. You don't need to bribe them or threaten to withhold services or anything. You just say it. And you convince them, and they'll obey the law, they'll obey the rules, they'll mobilize, they'll volunteer for the military, they'll do all kinds of projects, volunteer for the Peace Corps, Kennedy's project, for one of the examples. That's gold. What's the problem with charisma now? There's more than one, but Sarah?
The biggest one is that when you have charisma that's attached to one person, once that leader is out of power, the next person who steps into power may not necessarily have that same charisma. For example, there was Nasser from Egypt who was the head of the Pan-Arab movement, and once he died, it kind of fell apart.
Yeah, Gamal Abdel Nasser is the quintessential example of a charismatic leader in the modern Arab world. He has a heart attack in 1970 and dies. That's it. The whole base of your legitimacy just passed away. What now? Right?
And like LBJ after JFK.
Say again?
I said an LBJ following JFK.
Sorry, it's mumbling.
LBJ.
LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson.
Yeah, that one.
Right. He takes over from Kennedy, and he definitely doesn't have the charisma of Kennedy at all.
No.
Right? So that's ephemeral. And it's not any basis for an enduring, strong state. It can give you a window. A charismatic leader can give you a window to either strengthen the traditional sources of authority, of legitimacy, or create a rational legal system that outlives the leader in question. Now, a rational legal system, someone want to give me some examples of those?
Elections.
Elections. Basically, an electoral democracy where it's your government because they were voted in. Their mandate comes from the people. That's what a republic is, by the way. In a republic, sovereignty resides in the people, right? They are the source of the government's authority. So that implicitly says there has to be rules, like a constitution. Not every country has a constitution, but if they don't have a constitution, they'll have a series of basic laws and things that are equivalent. So the whole Republican system of government is one example of a rational legal system. What if it's a dictatorship, though? Can it have a rational legal system of
Yes.
legitimacy? It can. How's that work?
Well, they can start off by taking power through the rational legal system, like through elections, and then slowly start to gain power, like take power away and consolidate it.
Oh yeah, that's historically that's how Hitler came to power. That's how many. They were first elected and then they subverted the rules and changed them in Hungary, in Turkey today, in Poland. Where else?
Putin.
Putin in Russia, exactly. So they'll pretend that there's a rational legal system, but they lose a lot of people, don't they? A lot of people are saying, well, you messed the rules up, you rigged the system. And the government actually loses legitimacy from those accusations, right? Like, I mean, Egypt. Egypt has a fine sounding constitution. You read Egypt's constitution, you're like, this is a great liberal democracy. You know, the people have rights, the government has duties, and we have elections, and this and that. It's been rolled through never-ending extensions of emergency rule and law since the 1950s. It all doesn't mean squat. So when the Arab Spring comes along, first in Tunisia, but then spreads to Egypt in 2011, it's a bunch of people who are like, you guys aren't legitimate. You're fakes. You're not following any rules. You're just enriching your buddies. So your buddies likely, like you spent all this money on them, but there's not enough to go around for everyone. The country's big, and its income sources are limited. So only your narrow elite support base likes you. No one else is getting much in terms of services, money, or anything else. Under Nasser, every university graduate was promised a job, by the way. He did deliver here. But the Egyptian population had a very high fertility rate, and the economy wasn't growing exponentially like the population, and that was just unsustainable, especially given the wars with Israel as well and other problems. The army refuses to clamp down on the protesters, so the very basis of government authority is lost. And there's no charismatic leader, certainly not Mubarak, or El-Sisi now, by the way. Tradition is out the window. The monarchy got overthrown in 1952. And the rational legal system is like a crock, right? Not a strong state. It may be a very authoritarian state, but perhaps a brittle one, because the population does not see the government's authority as legitimate. But you can have some authoritarian ones that are actually strong, reasonably strong. Example?
China.
China. Exactly what I had in mind. One-party state, right? Chinese Communist Party. But there do seem to be rules. And they execute people for corruption all the time, and they seem committed to improving the country, and they at least pay enough attention to their own responsibilities as a government that they get legitimacy by following the rules. It's the Communist Party's rules of China, but there seems to be a rational legal system at play. You can also have that with a monarch, like the Saudis claiming descent, or king of Jordan or king of Morocco claiming descent from the Prophet. Someone who's descended from the Prophet is a Sayyid, by the way. And that's a traditional source of legitimacy, though. But you can have rules where anyone's allowed to petition the king if something's wrong or they've been treated unfairly and so forth. And the more people believe in that kind of thing, the more it can also function as a rational legal system. These are not mutually exclusive. You can have a charismatic ruler of a rather traditional regime that also has a rational legal system. In fact, all governments try to combine as much of these as they can. Everyone would like to be charismatic too, right? To what extent they're successful is a different question. Will you?
Yeah, in the case of North Korea, if you just have force and threat, can you create everything up the pyramid to make a strong state?
You gotta have something. You gotta have something. The people enforcing your threats and force have to have a reason to follow you too. Somebody's gotta be getting goodies.
I suppose the question I'm asking is, if you only have force and threat, can you build a government up and fill in all of these and be good? I
It's
mean,
traditionally how it happened. States, when they first emerge, are not especially good to their population in general. But they provide certain services, and especially with the French Revolution, suddenly they get promises of not only force and threat against the monarchists, they drowned 10,000 of them in the Loire River, and so forth, but also promises to the other people of a better life, and rules, and a charismatic leader in the form of Napoleon, who then subverts democracy for a while, but fires everybody out. And they don't have tradition, but they get enough from the others, and they built it up, so that France becomes stronger than ever. A country like North Korea, if they never get into this territory, they're actually pretty weak. They're so weak that they don't want to let their people communicate with the outside world, lest they find out, and there'll be unrest. That's a scared regime.
But in the process of creating, this pyramid, Kim Jong-un and his father, they created like a false charisma, in their leadership.
Charisma, sure, you can pretend that the leader is charismatic all you want. Like Saddam Hussein, when he ruled Iraq, every single major road, Saddam Street, the airport, Saddam International Airport, his portrait everywhere. Every school day beginning with salutes to Saddam, and songs, hired poets who work for Saddam, who do odes, sorry. Some words I don't know how to pronounce. Accolades for Saddam on TV. They have like songwriting contests about how great Saddam is. That's not real charisma. That's just a dear leader regime that's trying to pretend the charisma is there. But no one ever thought Saddam really had charisma. Now, any Iraqi under the regime would have said, oh yeah, great leader, the dear leader, right? But it isn't the genuine outpouring of support and emotion that you find with people like Gandhi, Mao Zedong, Hitler, Kennedy. I don't know, did George Washington have this, or was he at the time, or
Yeah,
not?
he was really admired.
Say again?
He was admired, yeah.
Yeah, so maybe you could throw him in as an example you guys would know. David?
Yeah, it sounds like a charisma and cult of personality are very different.
Yes, yes.
That's what they have, is cult of personality. And
Yeah, a real charismatic leader doesn't even need to do this, it just happens naturally. But the ones who want the charisma but don't have it need to do all this, right? But, a government that starts out, many governments that start out as just, they're the rulers over the certain area, and they take some money and buy some people off and share the wealth with some, they can build up to this. In fact, after the French Revolution, most of the monarchs in Europe started saying, well, all the French people are behind their leader with such enthusiasm. We don't have that kind of enthusiasm from our population. How do we get it so that we can compete with France? Because our mercenary armies just aren't winning battles against the French conscripts who are fighting out of a genuine spirit, with their levée en masse, fighting for the fraternité, égalité, liberté, and all those good things. And that's when the rest of Europe starts to slowly democratize, trying to get legitimacy up at the top of the pyramid. Okay? Now, in the MENA region, There's gonna be more than just Weber's three things. I'm not sure where to put it in. You can decide, but you can imagine that states after independence want to get legitimacy and look for various ways to get it. Weber's examples are three that we know now, but there's other ways to get legitimacy for a government. Can someone think of them? Siobhan?
I guess, like in general religion, maybe religion, but it's tradition, isn't it?
Well, yeah, religion, thank you for reminding me. Religion can be both tradition and a rational legal system. Oh, by the way, charismatic leader, how about Muhammad? Right? But religion, especially a religion like Islam, full of very explicit rules and ways of doing things, which together are interpreted into what becomes Sharia, is both a tradition after some 1400 years of the religion being around, and a rational legal system, Sharia law and so forth, right? So religion, but religion can also be a group identity, can't it? The Ummah, right? And you can get legitimacy by saying, you're members of the group, I'm going to make the group glorious. You see how that plays a role? Which takes us right into a similar phenomenon, which is nationalism. Right? And I'm not sure where nationalism fits there, but I think it needs to be there in our modern world. A charismatic leader maybe exemplifies the nation and makes people want to be part of it and feel the glory of it. Maybe you can put it in that way. But maybe it deserves its own category, kind of a fourth category of just ideologies, right? If you will.